There we go. All right. Close. Sorry about that. Things are popping up all over my screen. And there we go. We were looking at Robert Campion's Road Altarpiece, which is up in New York at the Cloisters Collection, part of the Metropolitan Museum, where we have a triptych. We've talked about different kinds of devotional works, diptychs, for example, polyptychs, multiple panels, right? And triptychs, which are 3 panels. And you can see the hinges here. The size of it is about like maybe about like that, roughly 2 feet square, which suggests to us that it could either have been made for domestic use, prayer at home, or it could have been for a small private chapel that was funded by the donors who are in the left-hand panel, right? We don't know exactly who they are. We have some idea because there are 2 coats of arms in the center, right, which might help to identify them. But they have commissioned this work or purchased it from Robert Campion, and by paying for it, they get special access to the Annunciation. You see them looking through the door. Now, people often comment that the difference between Van Eyck and Campion, if we were going to sort of like lay it down to one thing, it would be that Van Eyck is much more luxurious. He's much more interested in luxury objects, right? So things like jewels and glass, right? Stained glass, brocaded robes, right? Ermine furs. And Robert Campion, on the other hand, is a little bit more down to earth. He's still interested in details, but jewels don't seem to fascinate him nearly as much as sort of other mundane things that one might see around you. So we looked at Joseph's studio on the right, his carpentry shop. We talked about the fact that he's drilling holes in a board, making a fire screen. We talked about that, right? Yeah, making a fire screen of sorts, similar to the one that we see behind the Virgin Mary in the center panel. Right? That he's also been making mouse traps, which is a symbolism for Christ trapping Satan, right? And selling these to the world outside. A bustling street, just like we saw behind the Ghent altarpiece. We also see it outside the gate on the left as they've been let in, right? But as we look at his objects, they don't have that same sense of sort of crystalline sumptuousness that Van Eyck had. He's got brass and he does have jewels, but the jewels aren't as ornate. The brass doesn't seem as beautifully polished, etc., etc. It's much more sort of earthy, down to earth, right? It may have originally been painted on the outside. We don't know for sure. There's nothing out there now, right? Not every triptych had the outside of the wings painted like we saw with the Ghent altarpiece. Most of them did. Usually with another scene that related to what we see on the inside, sometimes with a prayer to be said on the outside. These are just blank, right? And I'd have to go back and read the conservator's report to find out if we think they've been cut in half and we're missing something, right? Now, Robert Campion's down-to-earth quality may come from the fact that whereas Van Eyck was living in Bruges and working for the Duke of Burgundy, right, Philip the Good, Campion was in Tournai, did not have a court patron, and was in fact a member of the city council, right, elected member of local government. And it's kind of nice to think of a parallelism there. This guy that is sort of a representative of the people on the city government making works of art that are also more sort of down to earth, if you will, than Jan van Eyck's. But he's recorded, and we can go back to the city archives of Tournai, find out a lot about him, his life, things that happened to him. And one of the things that we find out is that he had pupils. He had 2 different pupils. Well, there are actually 3. The best known of the 3 is Roger van der Weyden. Right? He's recorded as one of Robert Campion's pupils in Tournai. And then in 1432, Roger van der Weyden became independent, his own independent painter, rather than a studio assistant / pupil of Robert Campion. Now, looking at these two works, one, keep in mind that art history lies to you all the time. They're put up there as the same size. The painting on the right, the figures are life-sized. Right? So it is 7 or so feet across the base. It's in Madrid. This is on my bucket list. I've not been to Madrid, right? Everybody, even if they don't do Flemish pictures like these, says it's one of the most amazing things they've ever seen in their life. Right? Has an incredible impact. Whereas the one on the left is only about 2 feet square in the middle, which means basically it would sort of be about like this. Right, come over to John the Evangelist's foot is all. Right? So, but we put it up in the same size. Right, all the time. But it's important to remember that as we're in the classroom, we should think about the impact these things have as in real life. Now, is there anything in the picture that might suggest that Roger was Campin's pupil? Do you see anything that looks at all similar?
Use of color,
Vibrancy of color, it's even perhaps a slightly more vibrant even, right? I would argue that's one thing one could argue. One could argue that both of them kind of have an artificiality to the space. Look at the Merode triptych has got the tipped up perspective, so we can see the top of the table, which is tipped up even more, so we can see the object. Whereas Roger puts the deposition not in the landscape outside, which is where it would have taken place, but inside of a box. Right? There's a certain artificiality to staging in them, although that's not that similar. There's actually kind of a subtle stylistic comparison. Look at the face of the Virgin Mary in each of them. That sort of moon face, the way he handles the lids, the smallness of the mouth, the shape of the nose. This is really similar, right? Just look at the structure of the face between the two of them. Suggests that Roger van der Weyden might have actually had either a drawing by Campin that he kept and used or traced after his master. Some have even gone so far as to suggest that Roger van der Weyden had a hand in the Merode altarpiece, the Merode triptych, while working for Robert Campin. Right? Neither of them left any signed works. The attribution of works to them relies on secondary, tertiary information, right? Unlike Jan van Eyck. No Jan, Roger van der Weyden was here, sort of stuff, right? Or Robert Campin was here. But by looking at their faces side by side, you can see, in fact, that each of them treats the face of the Madonna, the face of the Virgin Mary, very, very similarly, right? Now, after becoming an independent master in 1432, Roger moved to the city of Brussels. Oddly, it's not even on my map here, right? So I had to put a circle around an empty spot. But Brussels was becoming one of the major cities in this particular region. Duke Philip the Good, Van Eyck's patron, would move from town to town, right, throughout the territory, from Dijon and then up, and would travel around, and was actually building a brand new palace in Brussels at this time to elevate its status on his little itinerary as he moves around. This is where Roger then moves on becoming independent from Campin, and almost immediately becomes the official city painter for the city of Brussels, which was a new position that seems to have been created for him. It's kind of like being court painter, but it's a little different, right? Your main patron is the city. You do things they want you to do. In this case, he did some paintings for the town hall that have been lost. They were kept under lock and key, right? They were scenes of judgment, of just judges meting out justice. Those are lost, but he did other works as well, right? And our picture on the right, as you know from the worksheet, was done for the town right next door, Leuven, which is just, the train from Brussels to Leuven takes maybe 7 to 10 minutes, right? And it's not like any bullet train, right? It's like going from here to Alexandria. It's that close, okay? So, but there was an independent town at the time, and this was made for the Guild of Crossbowmen. Now, every city had multiple militia companies that were sworn to protect the city. Right? And they were made up of an elite corps, not full-time, not like our army, right? But rather people who would pick up their arms and go to war when necessary. And the crossbowmen, they're not just archers, right? Archers use a bow and arrow. Crossbowmen use a crossbow, which has significantly longer range and also significantly sharper focus, right? Sharper aim than uh, than your standard bow and arrow, right? And they were the most powerful guild of military men in the city of Lübeck. This was their high altar in the chapel that they maintained. This is where they would leave their crossbows when they weren't using them, right? They would go get them in the chapel and bring them out. And so they felt that they were under the protection of the altarpiece in the church. And their patron saint, the chapel, was dedicated to the Virgin of Sorrows. Now, when it comes to having a patron saint, right, we talked about Siena's patron saint just being the Virgin Mary, just in general, right? Theirs is the Virgin Mary as well, but a particular aspect of her character, which is to say the Virgin suffering, right? The Virgin of Sorrows. And this was part of the growing interest in the 7 different sorrows of the Virgin, the 7 times in her life when she suffered pain in her heart based on the sufferings of her son, right? That she suffered as well. And so you can see that she plays a very, very strong role in this, right? She's in blue, she's fainted, right? Blue, again, the color of faithfulness, right? She's staying true to Christ's mission, and it is hurting her miserably, right? And instead of giving us a red robe, we see her instead fainted away. Right? So she is highlighted, if you will. She remains the focus of the picture because of the crossbowmen and their particular devotion to the Virgin of Sorrows. There's a much tinier little detail in the corners. There's this painted wooden tracery. That's what we call the carved Gothic decorative. And you can see hanging in the corner is a little crossbow, right? And there's one of those in each of the corners down below and at the top as well, right? So they are there as a symbol for the crossbowmen decorating this fake box that Roger puts this in. Now, because we're supposed to focus on the Virgin and her sorrows, what Roger does is he gets rid of all of the detail that might distract us from that. And what we see is not only the Virgin's sorrow, but how the others in the image share in that sadness. This is part of the reason why he may be part of the reason why he put it in a box rather than in the landscape, right? Van Eyck, when he enhances meaning, he adds all these little details. They go, ooh, what's that over there? Like a bull in the china shop, you know? Ooh, look at that down there. And each one of them, when you look, adds a little bit more to the meaning. Roger doesn't really work that way. He likes to focus on emotions in many of his paintings and get us to think about this amazing range of emotions that we see, right? He still loves details. I love the pin in her cowl, right? And how the starchy fabric is bunched up around it. But look at the tears running down her cheeks and off of her nose and over her lips, and how red her eyes are around the lids as she's been crying. As you look at this group of 7, 8 people around Christ, 9 if you count the guy on the ladder, you'll notice at least a bit down below that we have this, like Giotto had done, a range of reactions to the death of Christ, from the more pronounced, such as this woman, to the more stoic, right? And that's what Roger wants us to focus on. He wants us to find a surrogate, find an example for how you feel, right? There's St. John the Evangelist wearing red. We saw him wearing red before. Again, the same idea. Don't you get the sense he's been rubbing his eyes? Look at the red around the eyebrow and at the bottom, as if he's been, going at it with his fist. There's still this sort of Eichian interest in really, refined details like the stubble on his chin, right? And the way in which the light falls through those tears, but he's focusing on emotions, right? And everybody's crying, right? And just sad. And the more time you spend with it, the more sad they look, right? And that's the point, is that they're sharing in the sorrow of the Virgin, in the same way that the crossbowmen shared in the sorrow of the Virgin. On the far right is Mary Magdalene. Remember that she was a prostitute who converted to Christianity. She's almost always placed at his feet when he's dead. That's where she was in Giotto's Lamentation. And the reason for this is she remembers that moment when she wiped his feet with her hair when he was still alive, when she met him in the house of Simon. And here we see her crying as well, the tears running off her nose and cheeks. She has a belt around that has both her name and her name, Jesus and Maria, on it, as if she's sort of spiritually connected to him, right? And to remind us of her past, we have a couple of things. One, some cleavage, as opposed to, say, Mary, the Madonna, who is entirely covered up. But we also have that costume, the green, tight-fitting bodice with the orangish red sleeves. That is, in fact, the costume of a prostitute in the 15th century. So that reminds us of her past, where she's come from, and how she got to be here. But the focus remains the Virgin Mary and her sorrow, her relationship to Christ. And it's been mentioned, and I think this is what makes this picture really stand out and worthwhile mentioning, even though it's not around here, is how good Roger van der Weyden manipulates the composition, how well he manipulates the composition. So that as Mary faints, right, we have that theme. Christ dies, life goes out of his body. Mary faints, life goes out of her body in a way, right? There's a connection being made between death and fainting. And he brings this connection in by putting their hands right next to each other, with Christ's horribly wounded hand right next to her perfectly maintained hand. But then there's also the real subtle, but then obvious way in which her pose is exactly the same as his, right? As she faints, and here's many hours of Photoshop to get that to work out, right? But you can see that those two poses are exactly the same. And what Roger is using the composition to emphasize is that Christ's suffering in the flesh is mirrored by the Virgin's suffering in her soul, in her spirit. And in fact, there's a nice article on this that talks about Christ's passion and the Virgin's compassion, right? Her empathy for that. Even more recently, within the last 5 years or so, someone has noticed, I'm not so sure I buy this, but I kind of like it, that both of the bodies look like crossbows. Arms out to the side like the bow, the body becomes the barrel of the crossbow, that as they faint, they become similar to the little crossbows we saw in the corners. And that this would have appealed to the crossbowmen of Leuven, who had this on their altarpiece. Yeah, Julia.
Maybe this is also having to do with, using things on time and Photoshop and whatever, but was it a conscious decision to have her be so pale? I mean,
Yes.
dead and she just fainted.
Right.
Would he be as pale? Or
That's a really good point. So your point is that he's got a lot more blood in his body still, even though he's been bleeding out, than she has in hers. It's definitely a conscious decision for her to be as pale as she is, right? And that's emphasized by the white. And again, I haven't seen this in live, right? So I'm relying on photos, but by putting the white shawl around her head and around her collar, adds to her sense of paleness. And then putting their hands right next to each other, right, also shows you that her skin is significantly more pale than his. Well, it's kind of a, look at everybody else, and you'll notice that all the men are a little bit more ruddy anyway. And that's sort of a shorthand that men spend their time outside and women inside, right? But I do believe that we're supposed to think of fainting, which is what fainting is when the blood rushes from your head, right? That's why we faint, is that the blood is left our conscious centers, if you will. But as for sort of, I hadn't thought of her as being more pale than Christ, but definitely pale for sure. So I don't know if that answers it per se, but it is certainly, I think, it's a conscious choice of making her look almost as dead as he is, right? That goes right hand in hand with the way in which their poses are shared, right? Now, because of his ability to work the composition in such sort of a powerful, concentrated manner, it became an incredibly popular work. And there's about 200 different paintings in the 15th and 16th century that copy the Deposition by Roger Vanderbilt. You find them everywhere. And up in the Walters in Baltimore, we have a sculptural group that you can see, original painted sort of sculpture group, that also borrows from Roger's work. So it's based pretty much directly on it, right? This is, again, a legacy of the degree to which Roger's painting was that popular, right, amongst other artists, because he nailed it. He figured out a solution to a compositional, theological, symbolic problem that he was able to solve in the most judicious way possible. And that made other people borrow from it. I couldn't find colored pictures of both of them, but I was able to find this. So that's what it looks like I couldn't find one from the one on the left. But you can see that with the polychroming, it adds to the sense of vibrancy and similarity to what Roger had originally done. Even the figure holding the arms of Christ has the similar headgear that we see in Roger's Deposition. Now we've got two Roger Vandervijns down in the National Gallery. I'm going to show you one, and again, art history lies, right? Our figures on the right are life size, right? 5 or 6 feet tall, which makes the painting a good 8 feet across the base. That's how big our picture is, right? The postcard in the gift shop is bigger than the painting, right? 5 inches tall or so, right? So as we're looking at this in some detail, keep in mind what we're looking at, right? Now, it shows St. George, who is another patron saint of military men, slaying a dragon. This is from Christian history, Christian mythology, in order to save the maiden in the background who has been sacrificed by the town to this dragon, right? He goes in and says, why should we be doing this? Let's kill the dragon instead. And so there he is. He's taken off his helmet so we can see him better. It's nowhere to be seen, right? And in this gleaming armor, he's having at that dragon, pushing his lance into the back of its head as the dragon rears back at him. You'll notice that there's sort of a similarity between George's armor and the armor-like scales of the dragon down below. Each of them reflect. There's a sort of symbiosis between the two of them. This painting was probably for private devotion. Again, a painting that big is something you would carry around with you, right? There is another painting by Roger Vandervijgen in Madrid that is exactly the same size, and we used to think it was probably a diptych. But what they've done recently, within the last 10 years, is they did an X-ray and they found a crack running through the St. George that mirrors a crack running through the Madonna and Child. So they were originally on opposite sides of the same panel, and the cracks, I can't do this, right? The cracks line up, right? So someone at some point decided to sell two pictures by shaving it carefully down the middle, right? So equally tiny, right? This image of the Virgin Mary nursing Christ on the opposite side. And here the one that's in, so they were back together. They were paired up in the National Gallery in 2006, I think. You can see them side by side, but that's been the first time in hundreds of years that they've seen each other, right? But this is how it was originally commissioned. And again, this Northern European, this Netherlands interest in detail. Ignore the shadows up above, right? This is one of my photos taken on site, so I had to deal with the fact that the frame casts a shadow. But I have some good details to show you of how, even in a tiny picture like this, Roger has painted each of the details as exquisitely as possible. And what we have, just like we've seen in the Marode triptych, in the Ghent altarpiece, even in our Annunciation, that the background, the city that's behind the religious scene, is anachronistic, right? It's not a first century city. It doesn't attempt to be a first century city. It's a 15th century city. It's our world if we're the original viewers of this, right? We would look at this and we could recognize buildings like that in our environment. Right? So we see people milling around an inn down here with flags outside. This is either an apothecary shop or a bloodletting shop. The brass pots outside the windows, they appear in a lot of paintings back here. And people just walking around the streets, walking around the cities. And again, think scale, right? This detail is probably like my thumbnail, you know? So each of those individual figures with their little legs and their little hats is painted. My back starts to hurt thinking about it, right? Painting with that kind of precision. But even down to look at the reflections in the water of the people wearing red. It's absolutely phenomenal in its detailing. And this is typical of Northern art in the 15th century, right? People moving through the landscape, a woman there leaning out to see who's coming, a little wicker fence around her garden, another figure moving across a bridge in the background, coming to a cross at the crossroads, if you will, right? And a walled city behind it. And then as we look back into the distance, ships going off, smaller and smaller as we move our way all the way to the distant horizon. Unlike Roger van der Weyden, he's not trying to add little nuances of meaning, right? With Roger van der Weyden, not like Jan van Eyck. With Jan van Eyck, when we got into those details, each one of them sort of built up to a unified whole, right? Whether it was the Ghent altarpiece, the Arnolfini portrait, or our Annunciation, right? The floor, the ceiling, everything's sort of built together to this unified, complex, symbolic thing. But for Roger van der Weyden, the details are there, I think, to pique our interests, right? They certainly add to the idea that out here in the wilderness that's in the foreground, strange things happen, life goes on, right? That's part of it. But the details have that more sort of down-to-earth kind of appeal that he picked up from Kemp, right? Not necessarily symbolic, but just there to add to this overall sense of this thing could happen still, right? This sort of strange and wonderful, miraculous occurrence could still be viable even in the 15th century. Okay. So what we've seen is we've been looking at 15th century Netherlandish art, right? Art from the Netherlands. What we've seen is a move away from the international Gothic style to something much more spectacular, right? And the way that they break with the international Gothic styles, they take certain things that were there and develop on them. In particular, this interest in extraordinary detail, rendered in incredible verisimilitude, incredible detail. Yeah.
So is Van Eyck what would be considered the beginning of late Gothic?
These are, both of these are historians' terms, right? So Van Eyck didn't say I'm late Gothic.
No, but I mean for our purposes.
For our purposes, Van Eyck is, the beginning, and pretty much everybody that we looked at is. The late Gothic period, if we're thinking about the way historians call it, kind of continues through the rest of the 15th century. But we didn't see anything except for that sculpture after Roger van der Weyden, right? There's another generation of painters after Van Eyck, right? He had we've got really good examples in the National Gallery. We just don't have time, right? We got to get moving on, otherwise we'll never get to the 20th century. And believe you me, I would rather talk about this stuff than almost anything else in the museum. But it's a matter of moving on. So there's a whole second generation, third generation of artists that also continue this refinement and focus on tiny details. Right? And you can certainly find them down at the There's a whole room and a half full of them right around our Annunciation picture. Right? So yes, beginning of what we now call late Gothic. And we use the term late Gothic. Right? When we looked at earlier works from Giotto and Duccio, we talked about proto-Renaissance, right, or early Renaissance. And when we talk about Italy at exactly the same time, 1430s, we also talk about early Renaissance. We don't use that term for the North, because term Renaissance means rebirth. And it's a conscious decision on the part of the Italians, in particular, to revive a period of their national past. Right? So Giotto's interest in realism, Duccio's interest in realism, comes from a looking back at a national heritage. Right? Looking back at ancient Roman painting. And learning from that how to model in 3 dimensions, chiaroscuro. Right? Van Eyck is not doing that. Right? Van Eyck's interest in realism does not come from looking at Roman art. There isn't any Roman art for him to look at up there. And this is why we avoid kind of calling it Renaissance. Because it's not consciously trying to revive anything. Right? It instead elaborates on some details that began in the Gothic period, which was an interest in realism. We call it late Gothic because it's so much different from that. So, Julie, does that help to clarify it a bit?
Yeah.
Yeah, right? And these terms that we use, we have to make sure we distinguish between the terms that we use in the 21st century to characterize things that we see in the past and the terms that they used at the time. Because the Italians will, in fact, use the Italian version of the word for Renaissance, right? And it's a rinascita, right? But for us, it's Renaissance, which is a French word. Okay? Now, the International Gothic style that we had seen, right, spreading through Simone Martini, going to Avignon, from there to Paris, and from Paris to everywhere else, right, also remained a prominent style in Italy. So at the same time, we see this derivation from the works of Duccio, Simone Martini, spreading through all of Northern Europe. We also see it being maintained in Italy, right? Just because it spread doesn't mean it left home, right? It's still there as well. And we're going to look intensely at the one on the right to talk about International Gothic, but we also have a work by Gentile da Fabriano in the National Gallery as well, Madonna and Child, that still maintains that International Gothic style, right? And Gentile da Fabriano was working in the city of Florence. We've heard of Florence before. That's where Giotto was working and will remain one of the primary centers of Renaissance, early Renaissance art. In fact, everything we look at today will come from Florence from this point forward, right? So our International Gothic is still here, gilded backgrounds, halos made from tooling that background, this interest in sumptuous fabrics, some increase in detail and lyricism. It's still there, right? And as we look at the Strozzi altarpiece on the right, it's made for a man named Strozzi. His name will come up in a second. We can see certain elements in how the style is handled that might remind us all the way back to Duccio. Look at how high, for example, the horizon is relative to the frame. Not a lot of sky. In other words, the landscape tips up. So we look down on it. And the sky in the background, for all of the naturalism, realism of the figures in the foreground, the sky remains gold, right? Which is very unnatural. And in Gentile's work, a century later, we see the same idea. The landscape tips up in the background, a strip of gold sky, right? We look down on the figures. And I think you can also see, if we look at the rock outcropping, so there's in the middle, right? Let's do this, right? Okay, that didn't work. Pen, let's try this again, right in there. There's the ox and the ass, right? In the little cave. And you look at how the landscape is handled, how the top of that hill comes down and then kind of ends, right? And then look at the cave that's around the grotto in Duccio's work, especially above Joseph's hand. There's a certain similarity to how that's handled. That's still coming from the International Gothic style. Okay? Now let's compare apples to apples, as they say. This is the Adoration of the Magi from the Maestà altarpiece, right? Rather than the one that we have at ours. So it's part of the same sequence of images. And as we look at these two side by side, while Gentile Fabriano's is significantly more detailed and contains more stuff, and that's to be expected because it's huge, right? This is about 6 by 6 feet, and that is about like this. Okay? So the stuffing of Gentile's work with more figures is to be expected. What do you see that's similar? This is the scene where the three wise men, Magi, means wise men. Right? When the three Magi come to worship Christ, they follow the star, they arrive on the Christian calendar on January 6th, right, after Easter, the Feast of the Epiphany. Epiphany meaning revelation, right, miraculous revelation. So in each of them we see the three kings, the three wise men having arrived to worship Christ. What do they have in common? Insofar as the choice of subject matter is concerned. Yeah, go for it.
The old guy kneeling down and the baby kind of blessing him.
Excellent. So in each of them they've chosen the exact same pose for one of the three wise men. The oldest of the wise men kneels, kisses Christ's foot, and Christ gestures to bless him. Right? In the Gentile da Fabriano work on the right, he's actually touching his forehead, and in Duccio, he's sort of reaching out. Probably not coincidence, right? That we have the same, although in reverse.
Although Fabriano chose to give the wise men the gold halos, whereas...
Ooh, interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but yes, they have. And you'll also notice that the eldest Magus, that's singular for Magi, right? The eldest Magus has also taken off his crown. I would have to go back and think about that and sort of look into Magi crowns to figure out how often they do or do not have them. What else do we see that's similar? Things that Gentile includes that Duccio had included before. Might even be a little bit more obvious in that. How many Magi are there? 3. We're used to that from all of our little nativity setups that we put up at Christmas. But it doesn't say in the Bible how many there were. Right? They both chose to include 3 Magi. You'll also notice, looking at the 3 Magi, we've got an old one kneeling down. We've got another one with a beard, and who's between him and the third one. And the third one is sort of fresh-faced. In other words, the 3 Magi are 3 different ages, right? Old, mature, and young-ish, right? And that use of the 3 Magi at 3 different ages is meant to be a symbol for all of mankind. Right? This is all of humankind coming to worship Christ. The old and the young, and the people in between. Right? What else? Animals. Yeah. Brad.
Horses and,
Camels. Yeah. Horses and camels. The camels aren't particularly well drawn. But we have horses in the foreground, we have camels in the background. You'll notice that the horses, right, there are 3 of them, there's 3 Magi, and each one has a different color. How nice that is, right? So you can tell them apart. But you'll notice that the 2 horses in the foreground in Duccio are like giving each other the snake eye, right? They're right there. And in fact, if we look at the right-hand side of Gentile, they're even a little bit more angry at each other, right? And our grooms, the men holding the horses, are having a little bit more trouble holding them back in Gentile da Fabriano's piece, right? And there are indeed camels there, and as you look more closely, there's one in the back in the middle in Gentile's work as well, right? So certain similarities between them, and he's then just taken that basis and elaborated on it, okay? In each of the two works. And I wanted to show you some of these details and talk a bit more about them. As we do, the differences are not only the immense amount of population that John Teeley brings to his work. By the way, notice they both have the floating star, and in Duccio's it sort of looks like something out of a sci-fi movie. It's just up here, right? And it could just be because the gold has worn off of it. But let's look at them. There's our horses. And look at them. They're biting at the bits, and their eyes are buggy and wide. And the birds are fighting as well. Exactly right. So there's this sense that with both of these pictures, the Duccio we saw before, that there's why is Christ here? He's here to absolve our sins, but he's also here to bring peace to the world. Right? And so both of our artists have given this theme of the infractions, the difficulties that are out there, the warfare that's out there, that Christ is coming to heal. Right? So we've got the warring birds, we have that crazy ass horse, right? And pardon me?
Tigers?
And cheetahs. Yeah. Not the best drawn cheetahs, but cheetahs as well, which add to that idea of exoticism, right? Because remember that the Magi have come from all over the place. They've come from the three corners of the world as well, right? In fact, by the end of the 15th century, we see usually one of them is black, having come from Africa rather than, and we get Asia, Africa, and Europe, as well as the three ages of man, right? All of them will come together. And so the horse with the blue eyes on the edge of my detail also has an Islamic crescent moon on his forehead as part of his jewelry, right? And that adds to this idea that they're coming from the four corners of the earth and at war prior to Christ bringing the peace. More birds, and I love the people looking at them, right? The guy down below here looking up at the bird as it comes down. And I think there's another bird on a chain here, and there's the donkey's like he's laughing or something. and monkeys riding on the backs of the donkeys. We have all of these exotic animals that are being brought as part of this retinue, right? But these ideas were kind of already there. In Duccio, they've just become a little bit more elaborate. Now, for all the detail we're seeing, would you ever mistake this for a Jan van Eyck? He's not using oil paint. He's still using tempera, right? They don't use oils in Italy yet. And there is something that's a joy in the details, but it doesn't have that same refinement that we saw with Van Eyck. And that's typical for Italian pictures. There we see the lead Magus coming down, bowing before Christ. And now you can see that those halos are actually gold leaf that's been tooled in the backgrounds, right? We have the two midwives that we saw before with our nativity behind her, accepting the gifts, Joseph in the back. And I love this idea that the Magus is taking the body of Christ to his mouth. He's kissing it. But the idea that for an altarpiece, you see an image where the body of Christ is presented to someone's mouth becomes an analogy for what happens in the Mass. When the priest blesses the sacrament and you take the body of Christ to your mouth.
And the priest also blesses you.
That's right, exactly right. In the same way that Christ is now blessing our lead Magus, right? In this detail, and in the next one, you can see the degree to which, with the three Magi, one of the things Gentile de Fabriano is doing is he's focusing on those amazing clothes, right? The brocades and the patterns. And not in a way that you would mistake for Van Eyck, but is similar to the International Gothic style a la Simone Martini. So each of the three Magi have just these incredibly sumptuous costumes, right? And in this particular case, putting them front and center, taking up so much real estate with their costuming. Love the detail in the corner. He's taking off his spurs, right? Because he's gotten off his horse, so his servants down there, quick, get the spurs off, because they're difficult to walk in, so he won't sound like John Wayne, walking through the landscape going ching, ching, ching. This focus on sumptuousness, luxury, would have appealed to the man who paid for this. His name was Paolo Strozzi, and in the 1420s, he was the richest man in Florence. By the 1430s, he was run out of town by the Medici family, right? And in fact, they confiscated this work, right? It became part of the Medici collection after that. But at this point in history, Paolo Strozzi is paying for this. And as a man, very, very wealthy, it appeals to his particular tastes, right? Really emphasizing the wealth of the Magi. One last thing about this before we move on and look at other works of art and talk about how Italy breaks with the international Gothic style. I wanted to look at the background, because remember that the background's been tipped up so we can see all of these things. And as we look under the three lobes at the top in the distant background, what we see are three different scenes from the voyage of the three wise men. So they appear to us repeatedly, 4 different times. So in the foreground, we see them having arrived at the lap of the Virgin, having arrived at the birthplace of Christ. But in the back, and this is the best slide I could find, I'm sorry, we see the Magi first seeing the star. So there they are up on top of the hill, looking up into the sky, and you can barely see it up here. There's the star shining to them. And obviously we're meant to imagine the voice saying, follow the star to meet the Savior. And so there's their retinue, there's a monkey on the back of a horse, right? And they're going to now follow the star as they move their way up. As we come out of this wall, we find violence again. There's a mugging, right? They're beating this guy up to take his money away. And on the path that the Magi have to follow, there's threats and danger along the way. And this is, again, the strife that Christ has come to heal. In the center, we see them moving through the landscape. Again, our rearing horses, our birds of prey that we see in the foreground, a huntsman and his dog, a deer running off into the wilds. There's a cheetah going after a deer here, one of that retinue. Again, danger everywhere. These are some cute little details. Can you see that from back there? The cheetah's riding on the back of the horse. No wonder they're rearing up, right? But balanced somewhat precariously as the Magi continue to move their way through. And then on the far right, you can see them up at the very top moving as well. So international Gothic style, still very, very, very strong, right? And in the early part of the 15th century in Italy, just as it had been in Germany and in the Low Countries, right? What we saw when we looked at the Low Countries, the Netherlands, was that Van Eyck and others used oil paint to render details much more exactingly to move away from the international Gothic style, right? In Italy, we move away from the international Gothic style in a much different way. In Italy, the move away from the international Gothic style comes from a better understanding of three-dimensional space and from a better understanding of human anatomy. And I want to talk about the second one first. Right? Understanding of human anatomy. The figure at the far right stands in a balanced pose where his weight is shifted. So if we look at his two legs, you'll notice that one of the legs in the man on the right is locked and is holding the weight. The other one is relaxed. This comes from a study of ancient Roman and Greek statues. So the statue in the middle, Augustus, the very first Roman emperor, Caesar Augustus, placed at the main gate in Rome, now in the Vatican collection. Right? But look at the similarity of pose. especially in how the weight is borne on the body. Masaccio is understanding human form by looking back at ancient Rome. This represents for us a new phase of the Renaissance. Giotto had looked back at ancient Roman art, and what did he learn? Realism, shading in 3 dimensions, chiaroscuro. But you would never mistake a Giotto figure for a Roman figure. He's not studying Roman art to look at the anatomy, the body types. Masaccio is. And he's taking these Roman body types and plunking them down in Christian narratives, lifting them almost directly. So it's a new phase of the Renaissance where they're starting to really look at Roman art, not just as the inspiration for realism, but as the inspiration for actual figures that appear in the stories. Even the statue of Augustus goes back to earlier Greek sculptures, where that sense of balancing the figure by locking one leg, relaxing the other, and then with the rest of the body, flexing one arm and relaxing the other. It's something that can be traced through Greek and Roman sculpture. And Masaccio is picking it up and using it. He's obviously been looking at this stuff. And the term that the Italians in the Renaissance used for this was contrapposto, with a double P. If we think about the term, it becomes easier to understand what it means when we think about how we might translate that. Contra, against, counter. Right? Contrapposto, counterpoised, counterposted, where each part of the body is balanced in comparison to other parts. Relaxed leg, flexed leg. Relaxed arm, flexed arm. Right? So if we look at the figure in the red miniskirt by Masaccio, we see him understanding some of that concept, bringing ancient contrapposto into a modern Italian picture, translating sculpture into painting. And with that idea that he's translating ideas that were seen in sculpture into painting, you'll notice that the man in red appears twice. And it's almost the exact same pose, but seen from a different side. Right? So in the center, same guy. We've seen this in paintings before. We'll talk about the subject matter in just a second. But you'll notice when we look at the legs, that quite revealing miniskirt, right? That it pretty much is, from the waist down, the same posture. It's still contrapposto. And this points us to something that we find in the Italian Renaissance, in particular, is the idea that there was a friendly rivalry between painters and sculptors. Sculptors would argue that sculpture was better because they can make things in 3 dimensions. Painters cannot. They're working on a flat surface. But painters would argue that they could do it better because they can give landscape setting. Right? They can provide more context for the figure. Right? A friendly back and forth over which of these two is better. Painters would say, you know, it's a gentleman's art. I don't have to get all dirty. Right? Sculptors would say, yes, but I'm more like God who sculpted Adam from the earth. Right? So it's friendly back and forth. And Masaccio, by showing us the same pose from alternate angles, is kind of entering into this idea that painting can be like sculpture. Maybe Van Eyck is as well, you know? Think of the Ghent altarpiece, where we saw those painted sculptures, right, of St. John the Evangelist and St. John the Baptist. And the term for this is the paragone, right? A paragon argument of sorts, but not vicious. Yeah, Maria.
Is there any reason for this guy to be wearing short skirts compared to everyone else?
I've heard it was the style in the 15th century, that was a stylistic thing. And we see it in a lot of Renaissance works from the 20s and the 30s, right? And it goes back to something that we talked about before, which is this idea that oftentimes in biblical pictures, think Van Eyck, for example, or Roger or Robert Campan, we will see elements that remind us of the modern day. That it's not an attempt to make it historically accurate, right? So not only is he wearing clothing that you might see on a young man in Florence in the 15th century, but the building behind them also looks very much like modern architecture in Florence. Okay. So one of the things they're picking up, one of the big changes that we're getting from the International Gothic style is this interest in a body type that's based on having studied ancient Roman and Greek sculpture. Right? The second thing that separates this from International Gothic style is the sense of space. And you'll notice that the space opens up back to the mountains. It's not tipped up in the same way. Even though we have only a strip of sky, that's accounted for by the fact that the mountains, which by the way, I think they've been identified. They're outside of Florence, right? You can actually tell what mountains those are. But the thin strip of sky is accounted for by the mountains that rise in the background, not by the landscape being tipped up. In fact, the landscape appears to go back into space. And it's established by the building on the right. And this is what I want to focus on in our last few minutes here, is to talk about how Masaccio is creating three-dimensional space. He's using a new formula. He's using linear perspective. And linear perspective is basically a system by which, in rendering three-dimensional space, any line that is parallel and plunges into space will converge at a single point. It's the effect of like driving on a flat highway, right? And as you look down the highway, the edges of the highway seem to come to a point on the horizon, right? Railroad tracks, right? This room. And in linear perspective, right? If something is perpendicular to the surface you're painting on, goes back into space. The lines that are parallel on that object will converge at a point on the horizon. That point is called the vanishing point, and the lines that converge are called the orthogonals. And to give you a sense of how this works, I sort of sketched on this, right? So if there were a box facing the picture plane, right, facing the surface we're drawing on, the sides of the box we could trace back to that vanishing point. And it becomes a credible three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. It's rational, right? Get the idea there? Once you know the system, you can draw pretty much anything, right? It's because it's malleable, right? But it's very, very rational. It's all based on measurement, right? So if we think about this, and then we look at Masaccio's picture, you can see that he's brought this building there right next to the Sea of Galilee. There's no explanation for it other than it establishes space. And as we look at it, right, this is now the box I drew. This is parallel to the picture plane. That wall, there. And this then goes back. So you should expect all of the lines that are parallel, the base, cornice, tops of the doors, those should converge at a single point using this new system of linear or one-point perspective. And lo and behold, they do. And the fascinating thing is they point your eye toward Jesus. Right? The vanishing point, you can put any, you know this from your drawing class, you put the vanishing point anywhere you want. If you put it down low, right, then you sit higher. Put it up high, then you're down low. What Masaccio has done is to choose the vanishing point at Christ's head, so that unconsciously looking at this, your eye is actually brought to him. Right? So perspective is being used to rationalize the space. One last thing. Van Eyck didn't use it. Right? There is not a single consistent space here. The floor should be parallel with the left wall. They should all converge to the same space, and they don't. Did he fail? He didn't know. This system was brand new, beginning in 1415 in Florence. And the only artists we see using it between 1415 and 1435 are Italian artists who got it by word of mouth, particularly in Florence. It's then published in 1435. It becomes more widespread and takes a little while to get up to Van Eyck's area because it's published in Italian, right, in Florence. So a new way of conceiving of space that is going to help the Italians move away from the International Gothic style, and this is one-point perspective or linear perspective, right? That coupled with this new interest in Roman body types is something that we're going to see traced through 15th century Italian pictures, right? Early Renaissance pictures. Okay, we're a minute over by that point. So I will see you guys on Friday. On Friday, we'll do a bibliography exercise because your preliminary bibliography is due next Tuesday, right? So we'll do a couple of exercises on how to format bibliographies on Friday before we jump back into the ARC.